around, and then the floor is pancaked all the way down. We'll talk about that. Silverstein-Weidlinger report was responsible for changing that theory, because if that were true, it would have been the bolts that broke, and therefore Larry Silverstein, the overall owner of this complex, would not have been paid his $5.6 billion that he's been paid on the insurance settlement. Why? Because that would have been the building's fault instead of the terrorist's fault. So we had to have another theory. And the new theory states that the trusses sagged, pulled in the columns, they blamed the persistence of that connection, and then the columns buckled, and then the whole thing came down. Either way, it's something that we're going to be looking at very, very critically here in a moment. Then we have the NIST investigation, which took over all of these investigations in 2005 and came up with a 3-year, $20 million effort. We'll take a close look at NIST's work. These experts who worked on these buildings all worked from the FEMA report, or most of them, into the Weidlinger report and into the NIST report. These are not independent investigation by any means whatsoever. Let's listen to what FEMA did conclude, because it is interesting. Evidence of a severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including rapid oxidation, sulfidation, and subsequent intergranular melting. Very interesting. Remember, office fires don't melt steel. What melted this steel? Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Here is the intergranular melting documented for all of us. Thank you. Capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this former wide flange column from the structural steel in Building 7. Now, they document this very carefully in their Appendix C. Listen to this. Gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar, let light shine through. A 1-inch column being reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, having been thinned to almost razor sharpness. This was the flange, curled up on itself. This is the web of that wide flange column. NIST swept this entire Appendix C under the rug, and we do not have it in the official report today. Listen to this, though. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 had a small debris field as the facade was pulled downward, suggesting internal failure and implosion. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. What? Unknown? The best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, and then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. You spent $600,000 of our taxpayer money and over a year investigating this, and it has your best hypothesis isn't even right? What do you do when your hypothesis is not corroborated by the facts? You go back and you construct a new hypothesis. In FEMA's case, punt. And that's what they did. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. But unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve the issue, much of that evidence had already been destroyed, about 99% of it, in fact, by FEMA, before the report came out in May of 2002. Let's listen to what real investigation should have been performed.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
Why? Because all the steel was removed before the report came out. In fact, 800 truckloads a day. Easily the 3 worst structural failures in modern history. 250 pieces were saved. Crucial evidence that could answer the questions is on the slow boat to China, exclaims Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of the 125-year-old Fire Engineering magazine that brings together fire protection engineers to communicate with each other, showing an astounding ignorance of the government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. commission a fully resourced blue ribbon panel to conduct a clean and thorough investigation, is what they were calling for. If the evidence contradicts your fire hypothesis, destroy it. That's where our tax dollars are going. How about the 9/11 Commission, which was tasked with giving us the fullest explanation? No, not one sentence in the 571 pages of the 9/11 Commission report even mentions the destruction of World Trade Center 7. Is this one of the reasons, perhaps, that Senator Max Cleland resigns from the commission, citing it's a national scandal, the investigation is compromised? How about expert corroboration? How about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolitions expert? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. How about Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology? In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. How about Kamal Obeid with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a structural engineer? A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like fire? No. How about this forensic fire protection engineer, once again, Jonathan Barnett?
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed, we being the team that investigated what occurred on that day.
Building 7, do we have any foreknowledge of its destruction? We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down, says Chief Nick Viscani. Well, there was some structural damage, as we've noted, and they were concerned about it. By noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from the triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down, says Indira Singh, interviewed by Bonnie Faulkner on KPFA. Did they actually use the words brought down? Yeah, that's what they said. We're going to have to bring it down. This involves volition. Listen to these construction workers walking away from Building 7 and this police officer caught on CNN camera.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down soon.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys?
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Keep your eye on that building. It's about to come down. The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know? And how about Kevin McPadden? What did he say?
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Countdown? Does that imply foreknowledge? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Unlikely. The collapse happened. It's true. Jane Stanley is here announcing it. She says the 47-story Solomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. And there it is standing behind her. The BBC apologizes for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. But does that make them psychic? Unlikely. I believe we've shown that Building 7 matches all of the features of controlled demolition in the classic sense. Is it likely that Al-Qaeda could have had access to this building, which had to have been one of the most secure outside the Pentagon? We have to ask ourselves that question a few times, because if they didn't, then who did? This is as far as we go. You need to go farther, and there are resources at your disposal to do just that. I will point them out after we look at the World Trade Center Twin Towers, because as clear as the evidence is for the destruction of Building 7 by explosives, the evidence is even more clear in the case of the Twin Towers. When you look at it with a new pair of glasses and looking at the forensic science-based evidence. Let's get introduced here. Some called it the crowning achievement of the international style, this pair of buildings. Others, heartless modernism. In fact, architect Robert Stern calls it gigantic dumbness, right? It's two squares extruded just to the point where they become the highest buildings in the world. Well, either way, no matter how you feel about these buildings, they did have innovative structural engineering led by John Skilling and his aide, Leslie Robertson, who helped Minoru Yamasaki preserve the simple sculptural purity of his forms. And you can compare this building to the elegant Art Deco of the Empire State Building and come to your own conclusions about design. But it did eclipse the highest building in the world in 1976, but just for a couple of years until the Sears Tower outgrew it. The structural engineering innovations were quite extraordinary, lending the award, the engineering project that demonstrates the greatest engineering skills and represents the greatest contribution to engineering progress and mankind by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Let's take a look at what we achieved. We have 60-foot spans. We have a perimeter structure, which is like a tube structure, and this inner core. Let's take a look at it. Most high-rises up to this time were built on a dense grid of steel or concrete frames all the way throughout the building in a 20 or 30-foot grid. The Twin Towers were built as a tube structure with a very dense, strong mesh of steel surrounding the exterior and acting as a bearing wall, which resists the lateral loads, earthquake, and in the case of this building, particularly wind. Hurricanes up to 140 miles an hour it was designed to resist. This perimeter structure was 14-inch columns, 3 foot 9 inches on center. Inside was this core, a dense grid of 47 immense box columns, 4-inch thick at the base, 2-inch thick at mid-height. Prefabricated floor assemblies with 22-gauge steel decking, over which was poured reinforced concrete and held up by 29-inch deep open-web steel trusses. Now, these trusses were bolted to the perimeter columns and the core columns with these 5/8-inch bolts, which we talked about the different theories about what happened to those bolts. Now, this is a structure within a structure. This dense core structure would have remained standing 1,300 feet in the air if this surrounding, less strong floor structure were to have collapsed around it. In fact, the perimeter structure probably would have been left standing for a while until its lack of support gave in. This is the core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches along the long edge, almost solid steel at the bottom, continuously welded from the bottom all the way to the top. Now, any 1,800-degree fire would have been conducted throughout this 100,000-ton heat sink. That's the reason there's been no collapse of steel frame high-rise fires, because of this steel. Let's take a look at the structural imperative that was given to John Skilling.
John Skilling and Les Robertson were the structural engineers who designed the streamlined steel frames of the Twin Towers in the 1960s. Because a wayward Army bomber flew into the Empire State Building in 1945, the towers were built with skyscraper crashes in mind.
We had designed the project for the impact of our largest airplane of its time, the Boeing 707. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy a lot of structure, and still have it stand up.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
A very robust structure, in fact. The forces coming down routed themselves around. They arched around the opening created by the airplane. In fact, Iger says the towers withstood the initial impact of the aircraft. This ability to withstand the initial impact is hardly surprising, given the robust nature. Now, we have the North Tower being hit